All right. Well, with that, we'll welcome everyone to today's webinar, Common Plan Errors because Retirement Plans Are Complicated. Heather, I'll let you kick us off and introduce yourself and then give a couple of the housekeeping items, and then we'll jump into the session today.
Ooh, housekeeping items. Have your cup of coffee ready. We are going to roll up our sleeves here and have some fun with some compliance-related topics and some good things to think about. My name is Heather Herron. I am in the Austin location of Strategic Retirement Partners. I feel honored to be here co-presenting with you today, Bonnie, on this fascinating topic, and hoping that the takeaway for everyone joining today and anyone viewing this in the future, that you really feel like you have really grown and learned something from the presentation today, and as a result of it are feeling you're in a better place to just have a prudent process and have a good go forward path on what it is that will make you and your plan successful in the future.
Awesome. And I'll just add to that with a couple of other items. So a few things to keep in mind as we get started today. First and foremost, all lines are muted, but we do welcome your questions and encourage your questions throughout the session. If you have one, please get out your phone and we'll use the QR code, which hopefully you can now see on your screen. So this will take you, if you use this QR code, to an online portal where you can submit your questions throughout the session. We will monitor questions throughout and we'll get to as many as we can during the session. So Heather's going to be monitoring and hopefully we can just answer as many of those questions in real time as we go. We should also note that today's session is being recorded and we will share the recording with you and everyone who's registered later this week. Attendees will also have the opportunity to earn 1 hour of SHRM CE credit, as well as PSCA CE credit, which will be included when the recording is shared with you. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in and we will introduce a little bit more of today's topic. Before I do that, Heather, would you like to share any more about kind of your background before we get started and a little bit about kind of your role as a consultant at SRP?
I feel that's loaded because every day is a different day in 401k world. I do a little bit of everything here at Strategic Retirement Partners. I feel like it's what keeps the day interesting, but I would absolutely say as I've grown into this role and worked with so many amazing clients who really work hard every day to just be the best versions of themselves, it's inspired me to be the best version of myself. And I have taken a very strong interest in learning more and being an expert in the compliance side of maintaining the 401k plan. So it's important to me, it's important to our team, it's important to SRP collectively to say, how is it that we can be a service to you and an asset to you to help unwind any issues you've had and educate you on how to avoid them, how to navigate this crazy terrain in a way that's prudent and timely and cost effective. And, every year I kick off with my clients a year-end call to go over, what is it you want to do? What do you want to be when you grow up in a perfect world? And let's revisit about your plan and let's remind ourselves what plan design features you already have in place. And let's do some spot checking because we all get lost in the shuffle of life and distracted. And sometimes we just need a little tune-up to remind ourselves of what we're doing and why we're doing it and how to stay proactive in everything. So while I mentioned I do a little bit of everything, I would say my favorite part is just making sure my clients walk away feeling like they are in good hands and that they feel protected and that they feel supported in a way that, when we are having discussions, that they feel they are in the best care possible.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have the opportunity to present with you today. I think, as you said, you do a little bit of everything, and I think that's so true. And it's also so true as we start to talk about today's topic, which is common plan errors for retirement plans. So everyone, thank you again for spending your afternoon with Heather and myself. My name is Bonnie Treichel. I have the pleasure of working with Heather and the team at Strategic Retirement Partners. I am an ERISA attorney, but spend a lot of my time actually doing consulting with plan sponsors such as yourself through great partners like advisors and consultants with the Strategic Retirement Partners team. One of the things that we prefer to spend our time doing is really on the proactive side, helping to prevent retirement plan errors. But unfortunately, we know that retirement plans, as kind of our title alluded to, they're complicated, and we know that errors just happen. So what we're hopeful to talk about with you today is a couple of things. We want to talk about, number one, how can we think about our plan document and how we can really use that as that roadmap. I know some of you are like, I don't even know where that document is, but by the end of today, you're going to at least have as an action item to make sure you know where your current plan document is. So we'll talk a little bit about plan documents, which are really our roadmap or guidepost. We will also talk a bit about, I'm going to say, roles and responsibilities, but again, keeping in mind that particularly as things have gotten really muddy after Secure 2.0, what are the roles and responsibilities of folks like your record keeper, a TPA if you have one, folks like Heather and the team at Strategic Retirement Partners, and then what is your responsibility as a plan sponsor to really keep track of a lot of these things so that errors don't happen, or when they do happen, what do you have to do to fix them? And then how does that all come together with what I'm going to say, some of the top errors that we identify when working with retirement plans. So what are those errors and how do we correct them? Because again, the reality is errors are going to happen. It just is a fact. And so how do we correct them and document that accordingly? So that's what's on the agenda today. Again, we would like to remind you that in each of the slides, there's a QR code in the bottom corner. We are monitoring that so that as you have questions, we will be able to answer those questions. Just use the QR code and send in any questions, both if it's something like logistical or if it's content-wise. We'll get to those as we go. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the content, starting with our retirement plan documents themselves. So starting with the retirement plan documents, first and foremost, we want to keep in mind that all retirement plans are required to have a plan document. And ERISA is our framework that says all plans must have a document and they must identify in the document at least one fiduciary. Now, we won't spend our time today talking about who all the fiduciaries are. Catch us on another training session for that. But we will focus on that you've got to have a written plan document. And there's two formats that you can get that plan document. You may have an attorney drafted document. I don't see as many of those today, and I'll let Heather chime in if she disagrees with that. But generally, most of you are probably getting your document from one of two places, probably either your record keeper, or you may have a third-party administrator who's providing that document. So that document is one that your provider has gone to the IRS. They've gotten what's called a determination letter that says, yes, this is approved. And as long as you, I'm going to say, color within the lines and continue to use your plan document the way that it was intended, like you don't put a bunch of like fill in the blanks and go totally off track with it, you're going to have an IRS approved document. So what does that mean for the components you need to have for your plan document? Number one, again, if you're, I'm going to talk as though you're using a pre-approved plan doc, not attorney drafted. Number one, you'd want to make sure that you have what's called a base plan document. This is going to be, and a lot of times when I ask for a plan document, I never get the base plan document, but this is where the magic happens, because this is where you get all the definitions. Super boring, right? But that's where like you get the good stuff, because it's probably like 40 to 60 pages. And it's got all the definitions that we are going to, like when we talk about definition of compensation in a while, that's where you get some more like detail. So number one, base plan document, lots of definitions, 40 to 60 pages. Number two, you probably have what's called an adoption agreement. This is a bunch of check boxes that say, hey, based on the definitions in this other document, here's the check boxes for what we've selected for our specific plan. That's called an adoption agreement. That's got to be signed, probably done electronically these days, but that's got to be signed, and you need it to be dated. So you need that. You may have, and this is where it's gotten complicated recently, you probably have amendments to that adoption agreement. So it's like we're just stacking on top of that adoption agreement. So you need all of the amendments, and that's going to form your total plan document to interpret all the things we're going to talk about today. So signed, dated adoption agreement, all amendments, and your base plan document, also along with that IRS determination letter. That's what we're looking for. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that with our plan docs, once every 6 years, those documents get restated. So again, your document provider goes back to the IRS and says, hey, we're going to update this. Coming with this next restatement cycle, we're going to get things like Secure 1, Secure 2, and CARES. All those provisions are going to be wrapped in. So in the interim, hopefully you're keeping a checklist, or in coordination with one of your service providers, keeping a checklist, but ultimately you are responsible. This is the roles and responsibilities part of the discussion. You're responsible for keeping track of all of those things. So Heather, I'll let you chime in with anything you think I missed there, but that's kind of our starting point for this discussion. Is we have to know like our roadmap or our guideposts of like what's in our plan document. So that's our big action item 1.
And if you
Anything
don't know
I
where your adoption agreement is or your basic plan document, please make a note to check in with your advisor and get a copy of that.
Yes, and that's a great point. Like, I think that is something that probably your advisor consultant may be helping you with, but ultimately it is your job as a plan sponsor. You're lucky if you've got a great advisor, like someone like Heather who's helping you with that, but you do want to make sure you are keeping a copy in your own files too. So we now know kind of our big thing, we've got to have our plan doc. We'll move on to the next component of this, which is, well, how do we find retirement plan heirs? There's a number of ways that this can happen, right? We can find plan heirs either on our own, or we can let others find heirs for us. The first way is the best way to find heirs. And again, what we're looking for here is, okay, we've got this plan doc. We are required by the IRS, this is our IRS kind of angle on things. We're required by the IRS to operate in line with our plan document. So the IRS, it says, we've got the tax code, and then we've got subsequent guidance that comes from Treasury and the IRS that says we've got to operate this plan in line with this plan document. If we don't do that, the ultimate penalty is that then our plan would be disqualified. And we don't want that, right? We don't want our plan to be disqualified. So what do we need to do? And we'll talk more about some of the correction things here in a minute, but the proactive thing to do is to find plan heirs, and to do so by having what's called internal controls. So all plans are required to have internal controls and policies and procedures. And you should do that by also periodically testing on your own those internal controls and procedures. And so maybe I'll pause there. And I don't know, Heather, if you have any thoughts on kind of how you see plans do that, or how maybe you've helped plans think that through from time to time.
Yeah, this one comes up every year with all my clients. I think a takeaway here is that something to remember is that your internal policies and procedures might include periodically testing the accuracy of how your vendors are operating within or for your plan. For instance, if you've got payroll integration, are you doing the occasional spot checks to ensure everything's being calculated correctly? Think about those one-off transactions like bonus pay, commission, things that fall outside of a normal pay run. Or if you use a fractional HR service, are they clear on what your plan's definition of compensation, rehires, post-severance payments are? Doing these spot checks is a fantastic way to catch potential issues and keep everything running smoothly. And these are just a few considerations I'd add when thinking about what falls in their internal controls and audits, because you're thinking, why would I do that about an outside vendor? But when in fact it does affect you directly.
Yeah, that's a great point about, reasons to think about putting these in place proactively, because there's other ways that you can find these heirs. One is if you are a larger plan, you will have the annual audit requirement. So that's one way that heirs can be found, right? So any of our larger plans with more than 100 eligible participants, they will have their annual audit requirement. And so that's another way that heirs can be found. But again, it's certainly better if we have our own internal controls in place as opposed to our auditor finding them. Another point that I sometimes make when talking about the auditor is that audits are a spot check. They are not a comprehensive check. And so I've seen some frustration sometimes with plan sponsors that say, hey, this error apparently went on for 3 years and my auditor never caught it. Again, the auditor is not looking at every single transaction from every single participant with every single element of the plan doc. So sometimes it can take a while for something to come up in the audit. So again, that's why we also want to reinforce with good internal controls and self audits as well. The next thing we want to think about is, also doing some third party independent audit. Again, this is another method that can be a good proactive internal control, is working either with hiring a consultant or hiring some sort of third party just to come in and do a spot check if you feel like you need some infrastructure around your own internal controls or your own self audit. And then finally, the last way to find errors is a way we don't want to have errors coming up is with the regulator, right? When we haven't had the opportunity to proactively do it and we have someone else finding it on our behalf, which is certainly not the way to go. So, we've talked a little bit about how to find errors. Again, internal controls is the best way to do that. The thing I'd like to talk about next is what is not considered a correction as well as what is considered a correction. So again, we know that errors are going to come up. It's just going to happen. One of the things I think is helpful to think about is oftentimes when an error happens, I get a variety of different responses for how some plan sponsors entertain the idea of correcting different errors. So one thing that I've heard over time is this concept of the Scrivener's error. What does that mean? That means on the adoption agreement, and this comes up a lot during the restatement period, right? Or when we're going through a record keeper transition and we move from one plan document to another plan document, or pardon me, one adoption agreement to another adoption agreement. And it's the I checked the wrong box sort of issue, right? That, or I just wrote the wrong thing on the line. That is actually not an excuse in the eyes of the IRS to say, oh, I just checked the wrong thing. I actually meant to do this instead. Unfortunately, the IRS does not recognize that as a way to correct is by just saying, I did that wrong and I meant this other thing. And so I'm just going to change it going forward. Now, again, we'll talk about some correction methods with the IRS here in a moment, but just suddenly changing the check the box and putting a note in your file that says it was a Scrivener's error and I meant something else, that's actually not a way to correct a plan error. Another way that's technically not a correction, and I'll kind of mention this in two parts, but then we'll talk about a more practical approach to this, is sometimes I just hear, well, we're just going to fix the error going forward. So let's say that we had an issue where we didn't actually auto enroll folks for a period of 3 years, but our document called for automatic enrollment. And so then we say, oh, we'll just start auto enrolling them starting 1/1 of 2026, and we'll just do it going forward. Again, that would actually not be an appropriate correction in the eyes of the IRS. Just doing it going forward is actually not the right way to handle it. We need to actually figure out, how do we put participants in the place they would have been in had the error not occurred? So I'll say that one more time. The goal of a correction is to put folks in the place they would have been in had the error not occurred. That's what the IRS is going for. That's the spirit of it. And then kind of the last thing that, again, technically isn't a correction, but sometimes practically you might be making a business decision. Again, maybe not legally accurate, but this may be the business decision you arrive at, is to say, well, the error actually occurred for 10 years into the past, but we're only going to correct 3 years into the past. Technically, that is not a correction, but that may be the business decision you arrive at, though that in the eyes of the IRS is not the appropriate correction method. So we've talked a little bit about what actually is not a correction method. Let's move on and talk about the actual correction programs from the Department of Labor and from the IRS. Now, a couple of kind of like big picture concepts that we need to talk about before we jump into specific programs. And we've got a couple of different frameworks we want to talk about here. And Heather's going to make sure I stay on track with this. So the main thing we're talking about in today's program is really more on the IRS side. So keep in mind, when we have ERISA covered retirement plans, so not our governmental plans, but on our ERISA covered retirement plans, we have two frameworks we operate in. ERISA, which is enforced by the Department of Labor and EBSA. And then we also have the IRS side of things. Now, it doesn't matter if you're ERISA or not, everyone's got to comply with the IRS. This is the tax code side of things. On the IRS side, what they're concerned about is that are you operating your plan in line with the plan doc? And again, this applies to all of our tax qualified plans. We have to operate our plan in line with our plan document. If we fail to do so, there's a correction program for that. And we'll talk about that here in a moment, but that's item 3 on our slide called EPGRS. So if we don't comply and operate in line with our plan document, then we need to go through the EPGRS program. Separate from that, we have the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor is mostly concerned with what? They're concerned with breach of fiduciary duty. If we don't comply on that side, then we need to go through DOL's program. Now, some things actually result in errors on both sides, and so then you have to go through both programs at once. But we want to just make sure there's a key takeaway here, which is that there's 2 separate correction programs, one with DOL and one with IRS. And you may have to use different programs at different times or at the same time, depending on what your error is. Heather, how did I do there? Or do we think we got everyone still with us?
I think everyone's still with us, and you did a great job. Thank you.
These programs get confusing, right? Because it's dependent upon the error. And so again, that's where having a great partner like Heather to help you parse through what the error is can be very helpful in knowing where to apply for your correction. So one of the things I want to start with is just what happens if you have a Form 5500 that you do not file. That's the first kind of error and program we're going to talk about. So one of the things, item 1 on our slide, is for the Delinquent Filer Voluntary Compliance Program. This is really just focused on if you don't file your Form 5500. So again, I'm going to talk on ERISA covered plans here for a moment and make that assumption that that's everyone on the line. But if you don't file your 5500 timely, you absolutely need to know about this program, the Delinquent Filer Voluntary Compliance Program, because you need to be applying to that program. That program is going to help you because you could be subject to per day penalties with both the IRS and the Department of Labor if you don't timely file the 5500. And so that's kind of key concept 1. Make sure that you file by your 5500 deadline or file an extension and then file by that extended deadline if necessary. Otherwise, use program 1 on our screen. We'll move on then to item number 2, which is the Voluntary Fiduciary Correction Program. So the Voluntary Fiduciary Correction Program is a program on where I was describing like the DOL side. So this is a program where we're concerned if you have breached your fiduciary duty, the Department of Labor offers a few different programs for breach of fiduciary duty. And there's a couple of different ways that you can use that program, but there was a change to that program recently, which now offers what's called a self-correction component. And so the biggest way you would be using this self-correction component is something Heather and I will talk about a bit more later, which is if you ever have late contributions that you are late in sending your employee, and again, we'll talk about this more here in a minute, but your employee, not employer contributions, if you're late sending those to the trust and it's below a certain number of days and below a certain amount, so your correction amount's below $1,000, your number of days is below 180 days, then you can avail yourself to using this self-correction component with the Department of Labor. There's other times you can use that too, but that's going to be the most common. So you breach your fiduciary duty, you can either use this voluntary fiduciary correction program, file with the DOL, or alternatively, you can use the self-correction component version of that for a couple different things related to loans and late contributions. Stick with me here. We've got one more program we want to talk about. I'm going to give a high level and then we'll dig into it a bit deeper because I think this is probably, and Heather, correct me if you disagree, but I think the most common program that you're going to end up using, and you might have used it without totally realizing it, but you probably have had this come up before, is with the IRS, when you have had some sort of instance, like some of the issues we'll talk about later in the program, where you probably need to use the employee plans compliance resolution system, if that's not a mouthful. So let's just call it EPGARS because we love all these different acronyms, but you probably have had to use this program called EPGARS. And again, this is something with the IRS, and there's varying levels of this program. But essentially, if you have had an instance where you didn't operate your plan in line with your plan document, you probably had to use this EPGARS program. So I'm going to jump into kind of what are the different levels of EPGARS, which I always say there's 3 different levels. One of the levels is like a fake level, to be quite candid, because the last level, which is the one maybe I'll start with and then I'll back into the other 2, is called audit cap. And so it's this program where it's like, hey, you actually didn't correct it all. The IRS shows up at your office and then they make you do the voluntary correction program. So you have to comply and do VCP, pay the VCP fee, and pay an excise tax on top of it. So I'm not really sure that counts as a program with the IRS, because you're really just going through an IRS exam at that point. But let's talk about the other 2 programs that are part of EPGARS. So the first one is what's called self-correction program. Again, Heather, I'll probably let you talk a bit more about this, but I think the self-correction program is probably used over and over by plan sponsors. We had some changes to that came out of Secure 2.0 and some follow-up guidance that we got as well. But really, it used to be a little bit more limited, and it was more limited also in terms of the timing of when you could use it. I think like one of the Secure 2.0 best benefits we saw for plan sponsors was that you can have many more options for using the self-correction program. It's no longer limited to like a 2-year window. There are certain things like you do have to demonstrate that you have internal controls or policies and procedures in place and that you didn't intentionally, for example, create the error. But I mean, honestly, who's intentionally creating many of these plan errors? Not most of you, right? So again, you do have to have certain requirements, but you can use the self-correction, which essentially just means you put people in the place they would have been in had the error not occurred. You probably have to do some lost earnings depending on what the issue is, and then you proceed on your merry way. The other option is what's called VCP, or Voluntary Correction Program. This is where you're actually going and filing with the IRS, paying a fee, and then probably having some negotiating back and forth with them to then be able to proceed and get them to rubber stamp the way that you've actually done your correction. So I'll pause there. Heather, what am I missing? What do we need to dig into here?
I mean, I think if you've never had an error, you just haven't been doing this long enough, right? Or maybe you're not doing the self-audit and internal control. So I encourage the takeaway here to do that because catching it is imperative. As Bonnie mentioned, you can't just move forward. Every error needs to be corrected. But I would say the EPSR self-correction program has probably been a blessing to most of the clients that I work with who do end up having a problem. And as long as you qualify for this method, I see this as the most commonly used correction program. Resolution swift, and it's usually really cost effective. I think it's worth mentioning, though, how fewer and fewer providers are offering assistance when determining what method is available when an error is discovered. And this results in sponsors feeling confused, they feel unsupported, and they're potentially seeking expensive ERISA counsel to render an opinion on what process to proceed with. For anyone in attendance today, use this as an opportunity to ask yourself now, whether in a situation or whether you're thinking about when you could be in a situation, is what help are you looking for in a potential provider that you work with? Are you saying that when something happens, am I looking for that provider to help give me guidance? Maybe not all the answers, but general guidance. Would you be saying the advisor that you work with, you want to look at as a source to give you guidance as well? I think it's important to say, like, we all think we're in a good situation until something bad happens, right? And then that's when you're looking for the support. So have that open conversation. Not every provider or no provider really, or no advisor, even if they give you guidance, is going to say, this is the correction, this is the step, but they can give you guidance. And if they're not comfortable giving you guidance, at least having an open and very transparent conversation about what you feel like you need and how to be supported and supported in the right way is an important first step to have with any partner that you work with. Because again, not all are going to feel comfortable doing it, but some do, and some want to help you. But what we want to do is make sure that we're with the right partner first so that when or if that situation occurs, that they're there to navigate you through that versus, hey, you know what, can't help, you're on your own and you feel lost and confused. Because I know that that's been one of the most aggravating feelings that I think any other sponsor who's come to work with us has had is I didn't get any help from anyone, and I'm so grateful to have help from you. So just think about that, have an open, honest conversation, and then go from there.
I think that's really good counsel. I think you're spot on that what I'm seeing is I do think I heard you say expensive ERISA counsel, so I'm not going to be offended by that. But I think that's spot on that service providers, because of all the complications with Secure 2.0 and some of the changes around both on the EPGARS program and some of the DOL programs changing, they're just, and I'm not picking on record keepers or TPAs at all, but they're saying, we just can't, in many cases, we can't give you any guidance on how you should calculate any of these things, whether you should go SCP or VCP, seek counsel. And I think then the flip side of that too is in many instances, a lot of law firms, you can't open a matter for, it's to your point, it's expensive and it doesn't make sense and it's not efficient for the plan. So I think there are some ways to have some collaborative conversations and get to that right answer to still be really efficient. And it's really just about, like you said at the outset, looking for collaborative consultants to have those conversations, or alternatively, collaborative record keepers or TPAs, where you can still get to a lot of those good conversations. Anything else we want to dive in there before we talk about what are actually some of these most common errors that come up? So I think kind of the second part of our conversation will be on what are some of these errors and how can you avoid them? So again, errors happen, but how can you be on the lookout for these if you are thinking of either in or outside of your committee meetings, with some of the training you might be doing internally with folks in payroll or other functions in the organization, to help spot check for some of these things that inevitably are going to come up with the plan. We've come up with a few of our top things that we see, but again, feel free to add questions that come up with your plans. So the first one that we've identified is compensation. I think this one, I particularly towards the end of the year when bonuses come up, get a lot of questions around compensation. And again, we'll keep this one at a pretty 50,000 foot view for today's conversation, but it really starts with going to your plan document and making sure you understand the definition of compensation, and that your definition of compensation, which you may have more than one way that you have compensation defined for a couple of different places in your plan document, but making sure you understand what is that definition of compensation, and then how is that aligning with, for example, your payroll provider, to make sure that the definition of compensation that you believe you have in your document is how your payroll is actually being run and calculated. And again, making sure that's the case both for those employee deferrals and on the employer contribution as well. I think sometimes I'll see it set up properly on one, but not on the other. Again, another thing we want to just keep in mind is that there are different definitions of compensation. The most common definition is probably, W-2 wages, or whatever that box one wages on someone's W-2 is. But again, in your adoption agreements, if you go check that out, you probably see a couple of different ways that compensation can be defined. You probably see that you have the option for something like W-2, 415, 3401. And so you can check all those different boxes, but then you get to different exclusions. And I think those different exclusions probably are where you start to see some of the questions or issues come up. And probably the most common things I would say to look out for are on issues around bonuses, commission payments, gift cards. I think those are some of the issues where I start to see like big red flags coming up. And so again, we won't dig into all of these, but I'd say if you were on an issue spotting thing, it's like takeaway one, find your plan doc. Takeaway two, just go do a check on what is our definition of compensation and what does that look like as our payroll is set up. Heather, thoughts on kind of what you're seeing just from a practical standpoint?
Yeah, before I do, I want to hop into a couple questions that actually came in. One earlier, and I thought this was the appropriate time to actually touch on it, asking about commission and an employee making commission and that going into the retirement plan and how to know if you're matching properly and if they should be under Roth versus pre-tax. Now, I think the second question within that context might have to be addressed outside of this, but I'm going to circle back to what Bonnie started the conversation with today and go to your plan document. You really need to start with your plan document right there. And to the point of this compensation, understand what is your plan compensation, because are you confident to say that box of commission is or is not checked? So I would absolutely use this as an opportunity to say, go review what your plan document states. And then back to internal control, self-audit, cherry pick some of those people who have that type of payment. To Bonnie's point, what I feel like I see that breaks the hearts of all of my clients that I work with is the generosity of gift cards. Hey, I was so happy to celebrate their anniversary. I was so happy to celebrate the holidays with them. Of course, I wanted to give them a gift card. It happened to be a physical gift card that I ran through compensation. And for some reason or another, maybe they're using QuickBooks, maybe they're not, and the box is on if that plan compensation didn't get checked. So going back and reviewing what your compensation is, what are some nuances, and making sure, are those nuances considered compensation? Because just familiarizing yourself over and over again, and that repetition will help you avoid any conflict in the future. Any color to that, Bonnie, on, I think we could get into trouble if we answered too specifically on commission, not knowing your plan document. But anything else to add to that, Bonnie?
I think that's to your point, it's really dependent on how your plan is handling it. But I think those are the flags to look out for, and then probably follow up with your advisor, for example, to look at that, or your counsel to follow up on that. The gift card one it's a nitpicky one, but I think that's where like I do see sometimes a trend of like excluding fringe benefits can be helpful. I don't know what if you would agree or disagree with that, but I do think excluding fringe benefits from the document. But again, that's where there can be other things where maybe there's a reason the plan doesn't want to do so. So I think that's probably a good one there. I did see a question too that came in that is not related to compensation, but we may want to take it because I think it goes back to some of the plan document things, and I want to make sure I'm clear on adoption of Secure 2.0 provisions, which is there were many optional Secure 2.0 provisions that came up. And so just like when you're talking about, compensation and how you want to change your document, many of the Secure 2.0 provisions were optional. Some were mandatory. So you want to be clear of what was mandatory and what was optional. But the example in the question that came in was related to the $5,000 to $7,000 change for distributions. And so that was an optional provision that you do not have to include in your plan. So Heather, I don't know if we want to say anything else there, but I think it's just being clear about what provisions were optional, what provisions were mandatory or required. I think, the team probably has other materials on that, but just making sure that you know what's required, what's optional, and then take the proper steps to adopt those things you wish to include if they're optional.
Yeah, and I think a lot of providers, well, I shouldn't say a lot, I think each provider is just handling it maybe slightly different. So if you're questioning it, absolutely reach out proactively. There might be an amendment they want to send out to you, or they might say, hey, we're going to go ahead via your email to go ahead and increase that from 5 to 7, and then it might get included in the restatement later. So, assume nothing and then just proactively touch on everything that you can. So if that is something you want to increase, get that email going, especially if the forced out frequency is coming up and you want to make sure some other people get captured in it. I would say, circling back to the whole compensation issue, though, you are not alone if you are looking for the solution to avoid compensation issues. This is why I've seen a huge influx and plan sponsors looking out for payroll providers who integrate 360 with their current plan or potential future provider. So before I go even further, what do I mean by 360 integration? It is a connection that allows two providers to both send and receive data back and forth. So think about right now you are manually updating the deferral election, you're manually entering an auto enrollment percentage. All of those things would not have to be manually done when 360 connection is done. Now, who integrates with who? Again, that's an email to your provider and loop in your advisor, of course. It's good for them to know, but it allows you the type of integration to help potentially prevent errors. And beyond that, save time. It helps keep your plan running smoothly, especially when I feel like more and more often the feedback I get from my clients is that they're running low on human capital. So if there's something you might get back from 360 integration, if you're fortunate enough to get it, is time. And that, to me, I don't know about you guys, but that, to me, that is a very, very valuable asset that I would love to have.
Time is something I think you're not alone with, Heather. I think that's a really good point and something I see a lot of plan sponsors looking for as well. So anything else on compensation? Late contributions. Compensation and late contributions, I do think are probably the two biggest ones I see folks struggle with. Late contributions, we talked about this briefly earlier. This can give you trouble on both the IRS side and the DOL side. On the DOL side, this is usually a surprise to folks, but what it is we're concerned with late contribution of the employee deferrals to the trust. So again, back to kind of Heather's point on if you're set up with something like a 360 payroll integration, you probably don't have as much of a concern here. But if you're still doing more of a manual payroll run where it's up to, one person to make sure that they're hitting the send button every pay period, that's where late contributions likely become an issue. Or I see this a bit as a big issue when you're doing some sort of record keeper transition, payroll transition, and then it's like, oh shoot, we accidentally didn't do any of the contributions for 120 days or something to that effect. So that's where this starts to become an issue. Or when we have folks leaving the organization and those last paychecks, those become a problem for getting those contributions to the trust. What's the DOL's problem with this? Well, the way they look at it is that you are taking a loan from your people and you're not allowed to take a loan from your participants. That's actually considered, a breach of fiduciary duty and a prohibited transaction because you can't take a loan from the participants or from planned assets. So to avoid that prohibited transaction, then you need a correction. So what's kind of the basics of the rule anyways? I think Heather probably has some thoughts on this. If you Google, kind of the outer framework of this, right, is that, again, this is employee money, not employer money we're talking about here. But on employee money, technically the outer maximum is the 15th business day of the following month, or for smaller plans, those under 100 participants, they get a 7-day safe harbor. But technically, Heather, maybe I'll let you chime in here. Like, technically, is that really our rule that we have to follow?
I feel like I get in an argument with a small CPA shop at least every year about this. Please don't go to Google, or at least if you start with Google, continue to do more research. I would say instead of trying to match what the internet suggests as normal or acceptable, the better question is, and the standard you should operate by is, what is feasible and consistent for your organization? And once that timeline is established, it should be applied consistently and documented as part of your process. That is the new norm. That's not saying there isn't any room for flexibility given certain situations, but that is the new norm. As you mentioned, it could be considered a loan, and we want to stay away from that as far as possible. But for people who are like, hey, I am going to go on vacation for the next week, so I'm just going to let this sit until I get back just because, or any other, I was busy, it was a holiday, I took some time off. The Department of Labor shows no mercy. They show no mercy whatsoever. They have no interest in knowing what time you take. So please know that once you establish that, be consistent with it and have a plan. And that's not to say there are not exceptions. So if there are situations where, let's just say you're changing payroll providers, let's say you're changing 401k providers, and you're working on the data transmittal, these could be exceptions that are absolutely permissible to fall outside that normal time you've established without you considering them late. But just try and make sure that if you are unsure what that looks like, that you're going to the table to say, what does it look like for us? And then what does it look like for me if something were to happen to me, that I can establish consistency so that in my absence, things go as planned, and have that backup ready to go.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It's like make sure you have a plan, have that redundancy, and it is really a good trend towards working for automation on these things. But again, having that backup plan, because the Department of Labor does not have mercy. Your auditors will not either. If you're over 100 and have that annual audit, they're always looking for this. And this is one where the reason it's also important is that it does show up on your Form 5500. So if you have not corrected these errors, your auditor is going to put that additional schedule on your Form 5500, and it will continue to show up on your 5500, which is now easily scanned for the DOL and IRS. And so it'll show up until it is corrected. So that's just another reason to be mindful of that and get those corrected. And they're not super hard to get corrected. You just want to make sure you're going through the voluntary fiduciary correction program to do so, and then filing those associated Form 5330s with the IRS. So again, reach out with questions or throw questions in the QR code if there's additional items there. But I think it's just being mindful of those late contributions.
Remember, it's what you can defend also. Like, if you feel like it's something you can defend, that it's not late, great. If you're questionable on whether you can defend it, probably best to err on the side of caution. But I think what we've seen here since the election is quite a volatile market. Think about your timing and the consistency of the timing, and what is considered late or not even more important in an environment like this. Because let's just say, for example, again, the Department of Labor won't show mercy if you decide to take a vacation, but what if you took that vacation and didn't upload and deposit employee deferrals before we saw a market rally? Of course, what does that mean, or could that look like for you in your company as far as employee feedback after the fact? So we want to make sure we are staying consistent and avoid that.
Absolutely. The next one we're going to move on to is one that probably not as common, but also still can create a lot of problems and can persist for a while. And that's your issue with rehires. Again, this is going to depend on how you have your plan document set up, but one to really be mindful of, depending on especially the nature of your workforce. So the issue that comes up here is that you probably had a rehire, and then you don't give the proper credit for eligibility tracking or for vesting. You may have issues where, for example, if you are doing automatic enrollment, that can really create a conundrum when you've got automatic enrollment, someone comes back in a rehire fashion, you don't handle that properly, maybe you rehire them and you auto enroll when you shouldn't, or vice versa. And so that can really create issues for the plan. So again, part of this is just determining what the issue was based on the specific provisions of the plan, finding that error, and then again, you're probably going to be going through the IRS's EPCRS program, either self-correction or some sort of VCP based on the specific issue. But the thing we wanted to flag here, and I think, probably Heather, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about just what that common mistake is and how it can apply, is that think about rehires and how you can be handling them.
I feel like rehires are one of the sneakier things that creep up on a plan sponsor. Like, I didn't know what I didn't know, and I understand where they're feeling and where they're coming from. So just think about Bonnie's point earlier, and we've touched on this numerous times now. Go back to your plan document. Make sure you understand what it means and what it states for rehires. Also, why don't we throw a wrench into all this and say, did that rehire previously meet entry date or not before they initially terminated? Because that can be an indication on if they start over or are immediately eligible. You might be thinking, I have 100 things you just gave me to keep an eye on and pay attention to and create a process and procedure for, and now you're asking me to do this too. I get it. It's a lot. Our 401k fund, they said. I would suggest, and everyone's going to be different, work with your advisor on finding the support you need. Is there are options out there like other providers who are doing eligibility tracking, or they are outsourcing a 316 service provider to do the eligibility tracking for them that would say, I receive information on a previous hire. I know that they are a rehire and this should be their entry date, whether it be immediate or not. Now, if you have other nuances before, like non-elective plan, auto enrollment, things like that, don't worry, go to your provider. This is not necessarily the forum to go into those little details, but the eligibility tracking should be helping you identify what you can or cannot be doing. Payroll integration also is a potential connection to help implement that too for you immediately. I think another option that's gaining a lot of popularity is the pooled employer plan as well. You are not the plan sponsor when you are a pooled employer plan, but they are doing the eligibility tracking for you to help navigate that process for you. So I'll leave it there. Rehires are common for some, uncommon for a lot. So that I feel like for those who it's a little more uncommon for, they can really catch you off guard sometimes. So I understand, but don't worry, as Bonnie is going through in this entire slide deck, there is a solution for every problem that ever occurs. So don't be afraid and just don't let it paralyze you. There's always a solution.
I think that's a really good segue into the next one, which is contribution limits. I think when we think about limits, it seems like, and we'll share this actually on the next slide too, there's a ton of different types of limits. And now, even with one of the catch-up provisions that was optional, the super catch-up in Secure 2.0, we have some variability to the catch-ups and the different limits of how people are, applying all these different things in their plan. But one of the things that we just wanted to point out, and this goes to one of the themes that Heather was just mentioning, there's a solution for everything. So the big takeaway here as we come to the top of the hour is really this idea that have a plan in place for monitoring contribution limits and be mindful to how you can automate some of those things or work with your various service providers and understand roles and responsibilities, again, for monitoring the various contribution limits. Heather, any additional thoughts on just limits or how that works with different service providers?
No, ma'am.
Awesome. I think the big takeaway there is keep in mind, you may get some of that contribution limits monitoring from the record keeper. Maybe it's from the payroll provider. But keep in mind that limits change over time. So we want to make sure that the service providers are automatically updating those, that it's in line with what you've got going on with your plan provisions, and make sure you understand how that monitoring is occurring. As we close out the time, I don't think that we're going to spend any time on loan failures, but we'll highlight that loan failures is another area where we just want to make sure if you have loans as an option in your plan, that if you have a loan policy, or you may have, I'm going to call it an administrative checklist. So I see some as a separate loan policy, some as an administrative checklist that outlines the loan provisions. Make sure you're following that. And if you don't, then again, that's another area that both the IRS and the DOL take very seriously. And you may need to correct both with the IRS's program and the DOL's program when there is a loan failure. So the big thing is the participant is getting actually their loan program, and you have to then make sure you're complying with that or doing some sort of reamortization to get them back on that loan schedule. You can't get off track with that and say, oh, well, that's okay, we'll just catch up at the end. You've got to keep them on track with that loan schedule that they were given at the outset in that loan agreement. There's all kinds of other errors. We only covered a few. Heather wouldn't let me make this a half-day program. I I don't know why. But one thing I wanted to mention, we did get a question about if the slides would be available. The recording will be made available, and that will be sent out with the CE that we're about to share. So you'll get your CE certificates, both for SHRM and PSCA, as well as the recording. The slides will not be sent separately, but if you are interested in a copy of the slides as an individual handout, please reach out to your local Strategic Retirement Partners consultant, and they'll be able to assist you with getting a copy of those slides. With that, I think we've got just, a couple of like action items to consider. We shared a few of those along the way, but you'll see the top one, which is to make sure you're locating the plan document, you're reviewing the plan document, which is different, for example, from your summary plan description. Ask questions, work with folks like Heather for those sections where you're unsure. Make sure you're clear on roles and responsibilities. One thing to keep in mind is you as the plan sponsor, unless you've hired someone else to do it, you remain responsible for doing all of these fiduciary duties. And even where you have hired others, you're still responsible for monitoring. So I'd say just make sure you understand roles and responsibilities and develop that strong fiduciary program for monitoring over time. I'll turn it over to Heather for any concluding remarks as I share the CE certificate. And Heather, over to you.
I really don't have much to add. I think we've completed pretty much everything we need to. Very thankful for everyone who attended. You're obviously showing a vested interest in improving or refining everything you're already doing already. And remember, your advisor, they want to be in your head and know what you're thinking. You want to be in their head. It's always great to just, if you have a question, if you're unsure of anything, be candid, be open, create transparency. They're there to help you. They want to help you. They may not be able to give you every answer every day that you want, but I assure you they will give you direction. So please use them as a resource for you in all things so that you can have that business discussion, that holistic thing related or unrelated to compliance even, that makes it work for you. And it starts with a conversation. So thank you for attending. Thank you for being a part of this and contributing to your questions. We really appreciate it.